To understand what happened in the Second World War, we first have to look at what happened in the First World War. Germany, led by a Kaiser with some truly magnificent facial hair, was defeated by the Allied powers. As a result, the Kaiser abdicated, and Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty was harsh, to say the least. Germany lost territory, had to pay massive reparations, and was basically told, "You can't have a real army anymore. Best you can do is a small defensive force." As you can imagine, this left a lot of Germans feeling humiliated and resentful. On top of that, the global economy decided to take a nosedive in the 1920s and 30s, leading to the Great Depression. In Germany, this meant hyperinflation. People were using wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. The new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, was struggling to keep things together. It was a perfect storm of economic hardship and national humiliation. And into this chaos stepped a man with a very distinct, not so magnificent mustache, Adolf Hitler. He and his Nazi party had a simple, powerful message. Germany has been betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles is a disgrace. I will make Germany strong again. He pointed fingers at various groups, promising to restore national pride and rebuild the economy. In 1933, amidst the political and economic turmoil, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He quickly consolidated power, getting rid of all political opposition and establishing a totalitarian regime. The Weimar Republic was dead. The Third Reich had begun. Hitler's first move was to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles. He started rearming Germany in secret, then just did it out in the open. The other European powers, like Britain and France, were wary. They remembered the horrors of World War I and were desperate to avoid another one. So, they adopted a policy of appeasement. The thinking was, if we let Hitler have a few things he wants, maybe he'll be satisfied and calm down. So, in 1936, Hitler marched his troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone according to the treaty. Britain and France tut-tutated but did nothing. Hitler noted their inaction. Then, in 1938, he annexed Austria, his birth country, in an event called the Anschluss. Again, the world watched. Later that year, he demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. This led to the infamous Munich Conference. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany to meet with Hitler. They struck a deal. Hitler could have the Sudetenland, but he had to promise this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain flew back to Britain, famously waving a piece of paper and declaring peace for our time. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Just a few months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. At this point, Britain and France finally realized appeasement wasn't working. They drew a line in the sand. They guaranteed they would defend Poland if it were attacked. Meanwhile, over in Italy, another charismatic leader, Benito Mussolini, had risen to power. He was the founder of fascism and had big dreams of restoring the Roman Empire. He and Hitler were ideological buddies and formed an alliance known as the Pact of Steel. And way over in the east, the Empire of Japan was also on a path of aggressive expansion. Driven by a desire for resources and regional dominance, Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. Japan, Germany, and Italy would eventually form the Axis powers, a trio with some seriously expansionist ambitions. Now, Hitler had his eyes set on Poland. But he had a problem. If he invaded Poland, he risked a two-front war with France and Britain in the west and the massive Soviet Union in the east. Napoleon tried that, and it didn't go well for him. So, in a move that shocked the world, Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in August 1939. Publicly, they promised not to attack each other. Secretly, they agreed to carve up Poland between them. With his eastern flank secured, Hitler was ready. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. They unleashed a new type of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was a devastating combination of tanks, planes, and infantry moving at incredible speed, overwhelming the Polish defenses. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France, honoring their guarantee, declared war on Germany. The Second World War had officially begun in Europe. Poland fell within weeks, crushed between the German invasion from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east. After that, things went quiet for a few months in what was bizarrely called the Phony War. The British and French armies basically stared at the German army across the border, and not much happened. But that calm shattered in the spring of 1940. Hitler launched another blitzkrieg, this time against Western Europe. He didn't go for the heavily fortified French border. Instead, he went around it, invading neutral Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The main thrust came through the Ardennes forest, an area the Allies had thought was impassable for tanks. They were wrong. The German armored divisions burst through the Allied lines, racing towards the English Channel. They trapped the British Expeditionary Force and a large number of French soldiers on the beaches of a little town called Dunkirk. It was a disaster. It looked like the entire British army would be captured. But then came the miracle of Dunkirk. In a heroic, desperate effort, a flotilla of over 800 boats, from naval destroyers to tiny fishing boats and private yachts, crossed the channel under heavy fire and evacuated over 338,000 soldiers. It was a huge moral victory, but militarily, it was a retreat. With the British off the continent, France was left to face the German war machine alone. It was no contest. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered. In a final act of humiliation, Hitler forced the French to sign the surrender in the very same railway car where Germany had signed the armistice ending World War I. Germany now controlled most of Western Europe. Britain now stood alone, led by a new prime minister, the defiant and cigar-chomping Winston Churchill. He famously told his people, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." Hitler expected Britain to sue for peace, but Churchill refused. So Hitler planned an invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion. But before he could launch a sea invasion, he had to control the skies. This led to the Battle of Britain. For months, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, battled the British Royal Air Force, the RAF. The German bombers targeted airfields, radar stations, and eventually, civilian cities like London in a bombing campaign known as the Blitz. It was a terrifying time for British civilians, but they endured. Thanks to the skill of the RAF pilots, the advantage of fighting over home territory, and the crucial new technology of radar, Britain held on. By the skin of their teeth, they won the Battle of Britain. Hitler was forced to postpone and eventually cancel the invasion of Britain. It was his first major defeat. While all this was happening in Europe, what about the United States? The U.S. was officially neutral. Most Americans did not want to get involved in another European war. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt saw the growing threat of the Axis powers. He began to slowly shift the country from strict neutrality to supporting the Allies. He started with cash and carry, a policy that allowed Allied nations to buy U.S. arms as long as they paid in cash and transported them on their own ships. By 1941, Britain was running out of money. So, Roosevelt introduced the Lend-Lease Act. This allowed the U.S. to lend or lease war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. In essence, America became the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain, and later the Soviet Union, with billions of dollars worth of weapons and supplies to keep the fight against Hitler going. Frustrated by his failure to defeat Britain, Hitler made a fateful and ultimately catastrophic decision. He turned his attention back to the East. Despite their non-aggression pact, Hitler had always viewed the Soviet Union and its vast resources as his ultimate prize. On June 22, 1941, he broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers. At first, the Blitzkrieg worked its magic again. The German armies pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing millions of soldiers and reaching the outskirts of Moscow. It seemed like the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. But the Soviets fought back with ferocious determination. And then, the infamous Russian winter arrived. Just as it had for Napoleon, the brutal cold, combined with stiffening Soviet resistance, halted the German advance. The war in the East would become a brutal, grinding war of attrition, consuming millions of lives and vast amounts of German resources. And as the war raged on in Europe and the Soviet Union, tensions were escalating on the other side of the world, in the Pacific. Japan's ambitions were clashing directly with American interests, And a final, explosive event was about to drag the United States fully into the global conflict. But how that all unfolds is a story for part 2. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see what happens next, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out. See you in the next one.